Now, our next witness, I gather, would be happy to be called Amanda.
Yes.
Amanda, please.
Please state your full name.
Amanda Jane Beesley.
Take the book and hold it upright and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth.
Amanda, you're here to talk about your late husband, Andrew Michael Beesley.
That's right.
And we're going to put up 3 pictures and then leave one of them up. Henry, could we have 1090024, please? That's you and Andrew.
It is, yeah.
And then 1090023, please. That's a picture. We've cut off the rest of what he's doing. He's reading to 2 children.
Yes, he's reading to my friend's children, and they're absolutely wrapped in the story with him.
And then 1090025, please. And we'll leave this photo up other than when we're looking at documents. But do you want to just tell us when that was taken?
I'm not sure what year or so on, but there was a concert going on. His friend had a large band called Anaconda, and Andrew used to do the electronics, the sort of technical side of it. And I think there are some people in the room who will actually remember that band, and Andrew having to do the electrics for it and so on. But he was very happy when he was doing that, and it's a happy memory.
And can you tell us a little what Andrew was like?
Yes, he was very bright. He had a great sense of humour. He was always making jokes. We had a lot of sort of running jokes all through our marriage, sort of silly catchphrases we would use. He was very kind and generous, loving, always ready with a hug. Before he sounds too much of a paragon of virtue, he could be very stubborn, and he didn't used to like helping with the housework, that sort of thing. But he was brilliant with children. He would have made a great dad. Excuse me. He loved me unconditionally. He was my best friend. And he was such a special person. I could never believe that he, such a lovely person, would love someone as ordinary as me.
Andrew suffered severe haemophilia A, diagnosed when he was very little, a toddler.
Yes, yes.
We can see if we have up on screen, please, Henry, 1090003. And if we go, please, this is an extract from the National Haemophilia Database, the UK HCDO held records. If we go, please, Henry, to page 6. We'll see a list of some of the many products that Andrew received over the years for his haemophilia. We can see they're picked up at the bottom, late 69 and early 70s cryoprecipitate. And then from 1977 onwards, we can see that Andrew received full range of factor products, all the different commercial products, as well as occasionally BPL factor 8. And if we go to the next page, please, Henry. And we look at the bottom half of the page. We can see that pattern continuing through the 1980s, with Andrew receiving factor 8, co-8, cryobulin, etc. The medical records and documents that you've exhibited to your statement show that as a child, Andrew had to travel from his home in Crawley to Great Ormond Street frequently in order to receive the treatment.
Yes, I was quite shocked actually when I got his records after he died, and I got his records from Great Ormond Street to see how often he was actually in hospital, and that his mum used to go with him and stay in hospital with him, and they'd be there for a fortnight together and have a couple of days at home and then be back at the hospital, which must have been so disruptive to family life. He's got a younger brother, and so brother and dad are still at home. Must have been awful for them.
And perhaps reflecting that, arrangements were made when he was about 6 years old for him to receive cryoprecipitate on a prophylactic basis locally.
Yes.
Through his GP or local hospital. And then his mother learnt to administer treatment to him at home. And then in 1977, at the age of 11, Andrew joined Lord Mayor Trelaw's College, which I'll call Trelaw's for shorthand, in Hampshire. We can see from other documents that you've exhibited to your witness statement from Andrew's records a number of references to surveys, trials and research projects, and we'll just look at a small number of those, if we may, Amanda. Henry, can we have 1090008? And we can see there a letter dated the 16th of September 1977 from Dr. Painter, who is the medical officer at Trelaw's, to the local paediatrician. We just go towards the bottom of the letter, please, Henry. We see reference there in the last part of the main paragraph, as the hepatitis survey about which Dr. Kirk wrote to you in the past is now finished, it would seem likely that there would be no restriction on material and that he could be treated with a concentrate or cryoprecipitate as available. So a reference there to a hepatitis survey, I don't think you know precisely what that refers to.
I have no idea what that is, I'm sorry.
And that's before Andrew joined. This is roughly the time he was joining. If we then have 1090009, please. We can see here Andrew's mother agreeing to Andrew taking part in a trial of a new Factor 8 product as explained by Dr. Arenstam. Mm-hmm. Do you know from the conversations you had either with Andrew or his mother what that related to?
No, I don't. No.
So
Is that a date at the top of the page?
looks like February possibly, but it says armour. I'm not entirely clear what the rest of it says.
And is there any link then with 003?
I don't think so, sir. I don't think so. These are documents that are in Andrew's medical records, and I should say there are a substantial number of Andrew's medical records, but it's not clear whether there's a link between the two. 1090010, please, Henry. And if we go to page 3, which is the next page, we can see here, again, it's just an example. It's a letter dated the 2nd of June 1980 to Dr. Han re Andrew Beesley, and it says, I've recently communicated with the parents of this patient in order to obtain their permission to approach their child for a study of the half-life of a new preparation of Factor 8. And he talks about having erroneously stated that the project was on behalf of the Haemophilia Centre's Directors of Great Britain. In fact, it's a project merely at the discussion stage in the Working Party on Home Therapy and Prophylaxis, and that's from Dr. Arenstam. Again, I think you don't know whether that's the trial that Andrew's mother had been asked to sign her agreement to or not.
No, I'm sorry, I don't know.
And then we have 1090012, please. We see here again a letter from Dr. Arenstam. This is September 1980. Dear parent, I wrote to you last term. You very kindly agreed to the trial of a new product on your son. The manufacturers were not able to produce stocks of the material in time for us to do the trial last term, but there's a possibility we may undertake the trial over the next 2 terms. I hope you'll still agree to your son taking part in this study. We can see that someone's handwritten what, 2 question marks and an exclamation mark. Is that? Do you know whether that's Andrew's writing or his mother's?
It is his writing. No, I don't know who wrote that.
And then lastly, on this issue, 1090013, please, Henry. And this is a letter, again, September 1980, from to Dr. Arenstam from the Andrews local hospital. And it says, clearly it's important that research should continue into the best treatment of haemophilia. I would support your request to the parents that Andrew be included in the anticipated double-blind controlled trial of the new preparation of Factor VIII. Now, you've observed in your statement, based not only, I think, on your knowledge of Andrew's life, but the fact that you yourself worked at Trelaws. We'll come on to that at a later stage of your evidence. But you've observed as follows. I recall that boys with haemophilia were used for research at LMTC. To my understanding, LMTC looked after the largest group of haemophiliacs in the world. They would have been an attractive group for researchers to target, being such a large group, living in a relatively controlled environment with medics in a position to monitor them closely because they were seeing them regularly. I think I knew they were trying new treatments, but I would never have thought they would come at such risk. I do not remember thinking that Factor VIII was experimental.
No, that's right. I mean, I was working as a house parent and not involved in the haemophilia centre, which was, a separate NHS centre on the school site or the college site. So my only involvement was travelling on the van. The boys used to go up and down from one site to the other on the van for their treatment. So occasionally they'd be accompanied by one of the house parents for whatever reason, or we'd be catching a lift on the van to get into town. So we didn't have much contact with the actual centre. Occasionally the doctors would come and see us to try and tell us to stop the boys playing football and that sort of thing, but that was too hard to do, really. No, and the boys used to sometimes talk about things that they were trying, but there wasn't any sign that they were having anything that would be risky, and it would be more like they might be trying different physio regimes or different way of splinting or something like that, really. I wasn't aware that Factor VIII was experimental and no idea of the risks involved.
Andrew remained at Trelaws until, I think, late 1980. Is that right?
Yes, that's about right. Yeah, I think he left in the December, Christmas. Yeah.
And then he returned home because his parents realised that Factor VIII could be a well-managed home treatment by then, and he didn't need to be so far from home.
No, I mean, his family missed him very much and wanted him to be home. So as soon as that seemed to be a possibility, I think there was a new sort of special unit being opened up at the local secondary school, and they thought that was an ideal opportunity for him to go back home. So yeah, that's what happened.
Now, Andrew had, as we've seen from the haemophilia database records, been receiving Factor VIII products certainly from 1977 onwards. Do you know from your discussions with Andrew or from your discussions with his mother whether any information or warning or advice had been given to his parents or to him about any risks associated with the use of the Factor products?
His mum said they weren't given any warning. There's no discussion about any risks.
Now, you've provided to the inquiry a document. It's quite a hefty document. Henry, it's 1090021. It's called Factor VIII Children's Reference Manual, and if we look at the very bottom of that page, we can see copyright 1978, Armour Pharmaceutical Company. I understand you found this amongst Andrew's belongings and records.
Yeah, I came across it just a few weeks ago when I was asked to look something out for the inquiry. And yes, just found it in, I've got a huge plastic box that's full of things to do with Andrew. And found this in there. And I do sort of recall seeing it before, but I'd forgotten about it. But when I came across it and had a quick look at it, I thought that she might be interested in seeing it, so sent it to Collins.
And I think your supposition is at some point it may have been given to Andrew or during his childhood or his mother.
Yes, I assume that they were given that perhaps when he was at Great Ormond Street, possibly when he was at Trelaws, I don't know when, but yeah.
We'll just look at a handful of passages if we may. Henry, could we go to page 2, please? So we just see the contents. We can see there in brightly coloured lines the chapter headings, as it were. And as one flicks through it, there are lots of bright, engaging pictures and drawings.
Yes.
And it's very much aimed at children and helping children understand haemophilia and the treatment that they were receiving. If we could go, please, Henry, to page 16. I'm just going to read out a handful of the passages in this document that you've found. This is in the section on the history of haemophilia, and it goes through the history of treatments. And it says this: doctors first made factor VIII from the blood of cows, called bovine, and pigs, called porcine, and used it to stop bleeding in haemophiliacs. But they found that proteins in animal blood were different than human blood proteins, and serious reactions resulted from repeated use. They needed to make human factor VIII, but getting enough people to donate plasma for every haemophiliac seemed impossible. Many other people needed the plasma too. Then it documents in the rest of this page the discovery by Dr. Judith Poole in California in 1965 of what became cryoprecipitate. And if we go over the page to page 17, please. The booklet says this: the discovery of cryoprecipitate was very important to the history of haemophilia, but doctors already had new ideas that could make the treatment of haemophilia even better. When the doctors began talking about their ideas, companies like Armour listened to them and then took on the big job of making their ideas really happen. They worked very hard to find a way to concentrate the factor VIII in cryoprecipitate and dry it into a powder so that it could be easily stored in the refrigerator. They found special ways to draw only the plasma from blood donors, giving them back the rest of the blood. This way, people could give plasma more often and could make enough factor VIII for all the haemophiliacs who needed it. Haemophiliacs could even learn to treat themselves at home. And then it says this: today, haemophiliacs can do almost all the things other boys their age can do. You probably think that treatment cannot get any better, but many people are still working very hard and learning many new things about haemophilia today. Rabbi Simon ben Gamaliel would be surprised to know how wise he'd been about haemophilia many years ago, and even Alexis would never have dreamt that boys with haemophilia could have so much fun today. No one knows what treatment will be like 10 years from now, but it's nice to have the factor VIII to use while we wait and see. And then, if we turn please to page 36, Henry. We see this: the plasma that factor VIII is made from comes from blood. It is not blood that is donated by just one person. It is blood that is donated by many different people. It represents many different blood types, so it is normal blood. And then it goes on to explain how factor VIII is better than plasma. And then finally, next page, please, Henry, page 37. The question is posed: is factor VIII safe for me to use? It is as safe as we can make it. But it must be remembered that factor VIII comes from human blood and that viral hepatitis can be passed from one person to another through the blood. There is no laboratory test known that is absolutely certain for the hepatitis virus, so it cannot be said for certain that there is no risk of transmitting viral hepatitis when a medication like factor VIII is used. So if the hypothetical child reading this got to page 37, they read that, but you're not aware of that information having been given to Andrew or his parents in any direct form by his clinicians?
No.
You met Andrew when you were working at LMTC at Toulouse. You were 18 and you were doing a summer job as a house parent.
Well, it was actually like a gap year, and my intention was to go to university. I went to a very staid grammar school, and it was just like a factory almost, that we're going to go straight into university, and I wanted to buck the trend a bit and said I'm going to have a year out, which then turned into 2 years because I changed my career path. But I went to work there to have some time out of education.
And you didn't have much contact with him at that time, as you explained. You didn't have many direct dealings with the boys who had haemophilia, but you did talk to him from time to time and enjoyed chatting with him.
Oh, definitely, yeah. So I did. I know, we knew all the children within the house, but the haemophiliac boys generally didn't need any personal care, so we were dealing with the other children more. It would be occasionally if they had like an elbow bleed, they might need some help with doing their tie-up or doing their shoelaces and so on. But they were very lively and bright, and we all ate together in the school dining room. A lot of noise, a lot of people eating together, and so often I would sit with Andrew at the dining table, and I used to enjoy his company. He was always always had a very good sense of humour. So, yeah, it was fun to be with.
Now, it was a number of years later, in 1986, I think, that you met Andrew again. You were back working at Trelaws. Andrew was 19 and he turned up at Trelaws one day, I think, to see a friend of his.
One of his previous dorm mates had gone on to Trelaws College just down the road, and had just finished his exams and had nothing to do, and so they quite often used to send the older students that had finished their exams down to the lower school where I worked to help out with lessons and things, and just, I suppose, in part be a role model for the younger children. So his dorm mate Alexis came to the school, and so I enjoyed having a catch-up chat with him, and we both sort of speculated on how Andrew was, because we hadn't seen him for some years then. And I said, oh, I'll write to him and see how he is. So I did that, and not very long after, he turned up. He just turned up one day to come and see us.
Towards the end of that year, 1986, you started going out, you and Andrew. You've said in your statement that we, I think by that you mean at Trelaws, had heard about boys being infected with HIV by that stage, but Andrew didn't know whether he had been infected or not.
No, I mean, that's one of the things. I mean, that day that he turned up, I think, in retrospect, particularly, that he needed someone to talk to, and actually, when my letter came through, he thought that there was, that was a chance to go back to Trelaws and to be able to talk to me, and just, about his worry that he might be infected. So he didn't know at that point. He just needed to be able to talk about the possibility that he was.
You've spoken to Angie's mother, your statement explains, and she's given you a recollection of hers of seeing a documentary on TV and then phoning Dr. Savage at St Thomas's, where Angie's care had been transferred, and having a conversation with him. What can you recall Angie's mum telling you?
Well, it's slight, not exactly discrepancy, but slight difference in remembrances, I think, from what she told me a long time ago, what she said more recently. But piecing it together, what I believe happened is that the family watched the World in Action programme and actually saw Andrew's consultant from St Thomas's telling the world, ostensibly, that the haemophiliacs had been infected with HIV. And that was the first they'd heard of it, and that, obviously as a family, that was devastating. And Andrew's mother's described to me how they all cried together. But then I think the following day, his mum phoned the hospital and was told over the phone that, yes, he was infected. But from what she told me years ago, and what I know from what Andrew said, that she couldn't bring herself to tell him. He was left unknowing for sure.
There is, in Andrew's records, much later documents that refer to a positive HIV test on the 13th of December 1984, but there's no contemporary record of such a test or of any consultation that refers to that specific issue. You believe that Andrew didn't learn that he was indeed HIV positive until a date in early 1987 when you and he went to St Thomas's.
Yeah, that's when he knew.
Can you tell us about that?
Do you want me to tell you about us going to St Thomas's?
Yes, please.
Yeah, sorry. We'd started going out in November, and we talked about whether he was infected or not. At that time, we had no idea that the majority of haemophiliacs had been infected, so we still thought there was, some chance that he hadn't been. But we thought, did need to go and get tested. So we went up to St Thomas's together for him to have the test. And it seemed very strange because as we were coming away, the nurse said, and don't forget to come back for the results this time. And we didn't take it up with the nurse at the time, but we thought, well, why she said that? It hasn't been tested before. What does she mean? Didn't give it any more thought. Obviously, years later, I realised what had gone on. But so we went back 2 weeks later, because you had to wait 2 weeks in those days for the test results to come through. Obviously very anxious about what we were going to be told. We had to walk across the hospital from the new building into really old building. And I remember going up these really big wooden stairs that were reminiscent of some of the stairs at Trelawn's, which some of the audience here will remember, the stairs in Gaston House. Up these big wooden stairs into this, I can only describe as a really horrible, dark room. I remember that there's a window to the room, but there was a brick wall literally inches from the window. So it was just awful room. With an old gas fire, which was lit. And I remember us sitting next to the fire, facing each other, with the nurse to one side of us, with our faces getting increasingly heated up. You know, those old fires where you used to just get really hot next to them, but they didn't really heat the room, so we just sat there. I just remember that very clearly. And then the nurse told us, I think she was quite a bit of preamble, she told us that he was infected, which obviously was absolutely devastating. And I think she talked at some length to us, but I can't remember anything of what she said, because to me it was just like, let us go. I just wanted to get out of that horrible room, and there'd been no attempt to make it a friendly, a welcoming, pleasant room in any way, as far as I could see. It was just, I just thought, I've got to get out of here. We went back, had to walk all the way back through this hospital to the haemophilia centre and wait for a while before they got his supply of Factor 8 to take home ready. And I just remember waiting in that corridor, staring. There was a Monet print on the wall, just staring at the photo. I don't know why I was staring at the print particularly, because there's nothing else really to look at, to take my mind off things, and just having this thought that there goes our hope of a family. You know, that dream's gone.
What was the impact of that news on Andrew, as far as you can recall, at that time?
Oh, it was devastating for him. You know, we were told that he only got a couple of years to live. I don't know how anybody has managed to live with that. You know, obviously there's a number of people in this room who've had that same sentence spoken to them, and they've had to live with that. He didn't talk about things an awful lot. He used to keep things to himself. But I know that he had wanted a family. We talked about that because soon after we started going out together, it was quite clear we wanted to get married and spend our lives together. And we used to talk about children, and sometimes we allude to names we might call them and everything. You know, that was just part of what we were looking forward to. So yeah, that was all just swept away.
You became engaged in May of that year. You married in August of that year.
Yes.
And you started looking for jobs, the two of you, so that you could be in the same area. And Andrew got a job in an IT position at Trelawn's.
It was actually before we got married that we started looking for jobs. So I'm a qualified occupational therapist and started looking for OT jobs in the Crawley area, and Andrew was looking for IT jobs, and it was a question of who found something suitable first. But the IT job at Trelawn's came up, and that just seemed absolutely ideal. And there were certain people involved in interviewing and so on that remembered him from when he was just a little boy, so there was a favourable response to his application. So yes, he came to work at Trelawn's as a computer technician.
And in 1988, the two of you moved into a tied flat at Trelawn's.
Yes, yeah.
You've said in your statement you were aware of the risk that you might become infected. You were very fearful, not so much for yourself, but for Andrew, who'd have been devastated if he'd infected you or any child.
Yes. I mean, we were, if you want to say, fortunate. You know, I know there are many people who didn't know about their partner or husband's status before they were in a relationship, a sexual relationship, and so, you know, they became infected. We were in a different position where we knew from the outset that well, firstly that Andrew might be infected, and then we knew for sure that he was. And so we were able to take precautions, but I think there was a stage where the staff within haemophilia centres were very almost overcautious about things, and they just became very scared that people would become infected, and it was a sort of belt and braces, that you really had to be absolutely certain that there was no risk of you passing on the infection, and so we always took precautions. But I was aware that it wasn't just about saving my health. It would have been devastating for him if, in our situation where we knew that he was infected, that if he'd passed that on.
And you describe having very happy times, punctuated by sadness and the fear of losing him.
Yeah, I think because we were just told it was a couple of years, when we had almost 12 years together, if at the beginning of our marriage we'd been told we'd got best part of 12 years, then maybe the first few years we could have enjoyed more. But I was just so frightened of losing him that anything that was really happy, I would immediately think, but I'm going to lose him. So even in a happy moment, my brain would flip to this, but you're going to lose him. And I feel that I grieved all my marriage, even before I lost him.
Now that Andrew was living at Chalors, he received his haemophilia care from the haemophilia unit there.
Yes, yes.
And if we just have up on screen, please, Henry, 1090018. We can see that in 1990 there was a notification from BPL to Dr. Wassef at Chalors that a plasma donation sent for fractionation and included in this batch of factor VIII could potentially be infected. This was with hepatitis B, and therefore there was a withdrawal from issue of any remaining stocks of this batch of product. And then if we have 1090019, please. We've got a letter dated the 16th of May 1990 from Dr. Trowell to Dr. Wassef, and it refers to including a brief note on each patient to document the discussion. If you look at the bottom of the page, we've got the extract that relates to Andrew, and you've referred to this in your statement. Although I did not see this young man, we discussed his situation and results. He is hepatitis B surface antigen negative patient who has features of anti-Hep B core and Hep B surface antigen. He has recently received treatment with a large quantity of hepatitis B positive factor VIII, and we agreed it would be interesting to follow the features of his anti-hepatitis B antibodies. So that's a discussion taking place between doctors in May of 1990 in relation to hepatitis B. Do you know whether Andrew was informed of that at the time?
I have no memory of being informed.
Andrew was also infected with hepatitis C, and your statement explains that he was tested for hepatitis C in June 1990 with a first-generation test, confirmed in 1995 with a second-generation test, and you think he was told he was hepatitis C positive in late 1995?
I don't know. I don't remember exactly when he was told, but I believe that he'd been tested without his consent, because all I have is a vague memory of, I think it was someone from the Haemophilia Society, or been funded by the society, or connected with them, somebody doing research. So it might have been a student doing some medical research, or actually I don't think it was medical research. I think it was psychosocial research. But anyway, she'd come to talk to adult haemophilia patients who were Hep C positive, and I remember her coming to talk to Andrew and myself, and we just said, well, it doesn't apply to us, there's no point in you talking to us because Andrew's not positive, not Hep C positive, because we hadn't been told he was, and just thought if he wasn't. And then later on, at some point in one of his appointments at the haemophilia unit, we were told that he was.
You and Andrew, as you've told us, both very much wanted to have children. You said in your statement that you were told that his sperm couldn't be frozen. And what was the reason that was given for that?
Because it might be mixed up with other people's. So our GP had referred us to James Pringle House, and we saw a really lovely doctor there. She was so sweet. But she basically said to us that, because I'd had this idea that if some sperm could be frozen, then maybe at a later date it would be possible for me to have that safely, that we'd be able to go ahead and have a child safely, or that they could test that sperm to see if it was infective or not. So I just thought this was a way of buying some time, and so that's why I very helpful GP had referred us, and say she was a lovely doctor, and talked to us about basics of it all, and then just said she couldn't freeze his sperm because they might mix it up with other donations somehow, and it might be given to the wrong person, which I found, well, I mean, you just think, well, surely they have to be extremely careful with their labelling of samples, because otherwise how would they give anybody the right sample to fit in with their ethnic group or whatever, but because it was infected, then no, couldn't help.
You then read about a sperm washing treatment programme available in Italy.
Yes, a colleague at Trelawn's had seen a little snippet in a Sunday magazine and brought that into work for me. It was included in an article by, I think it's Mark Porter, the doctor, television doctor. So yes, there was this little snippet about HIV discordant couples being able to have children safely at this clinic in Italy.
And you were referred by your GP to a hospital in Basingstoke where you discussed sperm washing with a consultant there. What was his view?
I have to say the clinic there were lovely, all very welcoming and kind, and he went through a very detailed description of how sperm washing would work, so we could see very clearly it was quite a safe way of having children, and felt quite buoyed up at the beginning of the consultation. But then towards the end of it, he didn't put it in these words because he was a very kind man, but he said I wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. He just obviously couldn't take the risk of the infections and so on, so he couldn't help. To give him his due, he then went on to help us have all the tests that we needed to be able to go to Italy. So, he did what he was able to do. So I am grateful to him for that.
And you did go to Italy, you and Andrew, for the sperm washing treatment. What can you recall about that experience?
We were very nervous about going. So actually my mum suggested that we went for a sort of preliminary journey, just go and see the hospital, go and see where you'd be staying, stay in the hotel, go and meet the doctor, and, so not just go ahead with it, but just see what it would be like to start with. So we did that. Hospital weren't terribly helpful in some respects, because I found them all a bit dismissive, but, still, they said they would treat us, and explained about some of the procedures and so on, so decided to go ahead with it. It was a pretty awful experience. So we went over to Milan. I was told to arrive at the hospital at a certain time, which I did, and reported to wherever it was I was supposed to report. But without any explanation, they just said to me I'd got to wait outside, I don't know what number it was, but say room 57 or something. So I went out and waited outside this room. I had no idea what I was waiting for. There were other women in the queue, but they were all speaking Italian, and although I tried to learn enough to be polite in shops and so on whilst we were there, I couldn't sort of say, what are we standing here for? and then when I went into the room, it turned out I was going to have an internal examination. So that was without any warning whatsoever. That's what was happening, and that was all quite brutal. The doctors were not very gentle, and they didn't explain what they were doing and so on either. I didn't explain why I had to have that done, and because I'd had all my tests and everything done in England before I went, so that was all pretty awful. I then had to have injections of hormones to, bring me into ovulation and so on. And then I was told I had to do a test to be sure that I was ovulating, and then would go back to have. I think I had to have an injection as well. That's all a bit vague. Anyway, we then had to go back for the actual insemination, and I can't believe the contrast with the clinic in Basingstoke, where it was obvious that they were all set up to help couples in difficult circumstances to go through procedures to have a child. So it was all made very welcoming and kind, and this was just awful, just a very bare room, and I just had to lie on the trolley for the insemination. And Andrew just stood in the corner. He was just holding our coats, basically. He didn't even give us somewhere to put our coats. There was nowhere for him to sit, nothing. He couldn't even, he wasn't allowed to come close to me. And then there was some discussion going on when they'd examined me about something or other, and I didn't understand what they were saying. And then they just went ahead with the procedure, and we were just sent on our way. We had to go, and our flight was going pretty soon after that, so we had to rush off for that. And so it was all quite traumatic. And then obviously I was very hopeful that I was going to have a baby, kept willing that to happen, imagining what might be happening inside me, willing this baby, and then my period arrived when I was at work one day. So that was that.
You were then told when you were back in the United Kingdom that sperm washing would become available, I think at the Chelsea and Westminster Hospital, in the not too distant future. So rather than go back to Milan for a second attempt there, you decided to wait for the programme to commence, which you thought was going to be fairly quickly.
12 weeks. They said it's going to be going up and running in 12 weeks' time.
I think were told in April 1996 it would be about 12 weeks' time. But it didn't happen in 12 weeks. You eventually saw someone at the clinic in August of 1997, and you were told it still wasn't going ahead, and there was some concern that had been expressed by the hospital's ethics committee arising out of an article in the Sunday Times.
Yes.
But you were still understood it was going to go ahead soon.
Yeah.
I think you chased the following year, April 1998, and waited. And then what finally happened in terms of when you received the details of the programme?
I actually got a letter. I put in my statement it's 2 days, but I found out since it was 3 days, so not makes much difference. But 3 days after Andrew died, I had the letter inviting us for our appointment.
And that was nearly 3 years after you'd approached the programme, the hospital.
Yeah, and it was just like it was always just the other side of the horizon. Because had we been told, that it wasn't anywhere close to being put into place, we would have gone back to Italy until, Andrew became a bit too poorly for us to contemplate that. But yeah, there was a window of time when we would have gone back to Milan.
Now, you'd applied to the Macfarlane Trust for funding to help you go to Milan.
Yeah.
And we're just going to look at some of the correspondence between you and the Macfarlane Trust in relation to that. Henry, could we have please 1090026? This is a letter from you dated the 9th of October 1995, and it starts with, I'm writing to question the decision of your committee not to give grant aid towards the costs of assisted conception programmes. So there'd been some form of earlier refusal
Yes.
before we pick up this correspondence. And you said this, I understood that the sole purpose of the trust was to help people with haemophilia and HIV deal with the difficulties they face as a consequence of their infection. One of the most distressing aspects of living with HIV is the inability of couples to have a family without risking wives and offspring becoming infected. This is not simply about couples wanting a baby as some sort of possession, but is about bringing a sense of purpose to life, of seeing a continuation of self, of keeping pace with peers. And then you refer further down in the letter to the treatment programme in Milan, and you say this: before we can go to Milan, we have had to have a number of tests, some of which we've had to pay for. We will have to pay for our flights to Milan, for accommodation and treatment. None of this would have been necessary if my husband had not contracted HIV from infected blood products. I believe that the Trust should at the very least be prepared to accept an application for a grant towards the costs involved in this programme and should give it careful consideration. If we then turn on to page 3, please, Henry, we can see the letter you received from the Macfarlane Trust 21st of December 1995. It says, I'm sorry to be so slow in writing again to you, but the trustees were unable to come to a final decision at their meeting in November, pending some further inquiries by our medical trustee, Dr. Elizabeth Main. The trustees saw your letter anonymised, but this was in the context of re-examining the whole subject of assistance with conception, on which their previous decision had been not to give any financial assistance. Although every request to the Trust of any kind is looked at individually, there has to be some underlying policy or guideline on the matter to ensure consistency and fairness. And then the next paragraph refers to there going to be a potential of a further decision and says this: I believe that they, that's the trustees, are likely to make some change to their earlier exclusion, but I also feel that this is unlikely to include any treatments not fully recognised and approved by UK medical authorities or any treatment outside the UK. At present, I'm afraid this exclusion would apply to Dr. Semprini's treatment, whether done by him in Italy or by an associate in the UK. If we go then to page 4, we can see that by mid-February you're still waiting for a response. You say in the second paragraph of your letter, I continue to wait for a proper reply to my request for a grant towards the cost of assisted conception. And then if we go on, please, Henry, to page 6, we see a document from the Macfarlane Trust dated the 3rd of April 1996. This particular document is addressed to Dr. Wassef. It says this: as you may be aware, the Trust has made payments in the past to couples wishing to have a child without risk of infection to the mother. Typically, these payments have been a contribution towards the cost of donor insemination treatment. Payments in this category were suspended last year whilst trustees considered a fair and consistent policy covering this form of assistance. Our trustees also gave careful consideration to whether their policy should make provision for payments to cover treatment based on new reproductive technology, particularly sperm washing. The purpose of this letter is to let you know that our trustees have settled on a policy which allows the Trust to contribute towards the cost of private assisted reproduction treatment, provided that the treatment is approved by the Human Fertilisation Embryology Authority and available from the NHS. Applicants must first apply through the NHS and satisfy counselling criteria. If treatment is approved in principle but subject to delay, the Trust will then contribute to the costs of private treatment. So that was the decision communicated in April of 1996. And we can see, if we go on to page 8, please, the letter that was written to you. Picking it up in the second paragraph, I'm sorry to say that for the present at least, your request does not fall into the trustees' criteria. For any type of medical treatment for this or any other purpose, the trustees are concerned that to give financial support implies an acceptance/endorsement of the process, if not an actual recommendation. And they are therefore reluctant to be involved with anything experimental, particularly if it's not accepted by the National Health Service, or in this case by the Human Fertilisation Embryology Authority either. Then it says this in the next paragraph: we, that's the two of the individuals at the Trust, admit your views are entirely tenable, even though they do not coincide with the present views of the trustees. And then he says in the final paragraph he will raise the matter with the trustees again and see if we can persuade them to widen rather than move the goalposts. And you wrote back, Amanda, just look at the terms of your letter, page 9, please, Henry. 16th of April 96, halfway down the page. You said this: "We do not have the time available to wait for Dr. Semprini's procedure to be adopted by the NHS. We have to proceed now whilst my husband is still alive. Why can the trustees not treat me as an adult capable of assessing risk to my health and support me in taking what I consider to be the safest option of conception?" And then you suggest the possibility of asking couples to sign an agreement to show your understanding that the trustees would not be somehow endorsing the procedure. And then over the page, please, Henry, page 10, second paragraph. "It amazes me that the trustees..." Sorry, I'll wait till it's up. "It amazes me that the trustees will agree to helping us with expenses involved in moving house, but will not help me to have a baby safely. People move house whether they're HIV positive or not. They do not have to go all the way to Milan to have a baby. Why not help us with the one thing that is most important to us, especially as it is something that would make so much difference to us, bringing great joy into lives that have been totally devastated by HIV." And then, if we go to page 12, please, Henry. You wrote again the next month, setting out your understanding that the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority's Ethics Committee had agreed to HIV discordant couples having IVF treatment, and said this: "The Macfarlane trustees have said they would not help to pay for sperm washing procedures because they were not approved by the HFEA. But surely they can no longer refuse to help now that the HFEA have approved a technique that carries far more risk of seroconversion than sperm washing does." And finally, page 13, the response that you received from the chairman of the Macfarlane Trust, 6th of June 1996. Second paragraph: "I'm sorry to tell you that the trustees did not agree to extend the terms under which they are prepared to assist with the costs of reduced risk conception. The trustees had considerable sympathy for your views." And then it goes on to say in the penultimate paragraph, "The decision ultimately rests on what the trust could and can do with its limited resources. You make the point about other types of grant which you consider less important. We accept that as a very reasonable personal view, but the choice before the trustees must take account of overall priorities for use of resources as well as each individual case. Deciding priorities is always difficult. Sadly, the decisions are never going to suit everyone. One call on trust resources that has never been accepted is for medical treatment of any kind, either for people registered or for members of their families. Likewise, we have not contributed to research or tests of any kind, either in abstract scientific terms or in clinical trials with individuals. If we are to make any departure at all from these exclusions, it could only be on a very limited basis, and any decision must rest with the discretion of the trustees." That was your attempt to ask the Macfarlane Trust to help you pay for what by then would have been a second trip to Milan. Do you have any observations on that issue and the stance taken by the Macfarlane Trust?
I think it's just typical of their approach, really, that they were just paternalistic organisation and that they held so much control over what we could and couldn't do with our lives. I think if you were looking at it in terms of assessing risk for people, I think that that sort of attitude would have pushed some people to have taken the risk to have had a baby, naturally, and taken the risk of seroconversion of the wife and possibly the baby. We wanted to go ahead with a procedure that had been shown to be successful, and I can't remember the numbers now. I think I put it in one of the letters. But there were very many people who'd gone through that procedure in Italy, and there hadn't been a single seroconversion. But they just wanted to play God with us, wouldn't allow us to make our own decisions, which we should have been able to.
And you say in your statement that you were and you still remain deeply saddened that you were never able to have a baby with Andrew. Andrew began to be really unwell in the course of the 1990s. He had started on AZT. He began what you've described as a period of 5 years of illnesses and reactions to drug regimes. What can you recall?
Until the illness that actually killed him, I believe all the illnesses that he had were related to the drugs that he took. It started with him taking AZT and Septrin. He was put on Septrin against pneumonia. We weren't warned that there could be a really bad reaction to that, and my understanding is that Septrin actually often brings about severe reactions. Andrew sadly seemed to just suffer with almost every side effect you could have to any drug he took. So with Septrin, he became incredibly ill very, very quickly. He was having hallucinations, covered in a rash, high temperature. I was so panicked by it. I remember, I phoned the haemophilia centre. I mean, bearing in mind that we lived within the complex of Trelaws, we just lived over the road from the school. The haemophilia centre was 3 miles down the road, and I very naively thought that, because he was so poorly, that one of the nurses, who literally was, say, 3 miles down the road, could have got in a car and come to see what was the matter with him and helped us. But they just told me to get him some Piriton. It would have been helpful if they'd said before he took the Septrin that it would be a good idea to have some Piriton in, just in case. So I don't know what they expected me to do, how they expected me to get hold of Piriton just like that. So I would have had to drive 4 miles into town to get some and leave him on his own to do that. And as it happened, the way things were in those days were quite different from now, but the Trelaws had a medical centre. Some of the men here would remember it as sick bay, but in those days you could actually go and ask the nurses if you could have paracetamol if you had a headache or something, and I just went over to them in a panic and said, have you got any Piriton that I can have? Andrew's really poorly. And they kindly gave me some. I know in these days of the way everything is double checked and controlled, in any situation with anybody giving you medication they probably wouldn't have been allowed to do that, but then they could, and I'm so grateful that they did, because that obviously did help to bring his symptoms down. But that was the first instance, and he was on AZT, but it made him feel so ill, and he just said to me, I'm not taking this, I can't live like this, I'm just not going to take it.
You and he became concerned that the haemophilia unit at Trelaws wasn't specialist in HIV. And so you sought advice and support elsewhere in terms of Andrew's HIV care. What can you recall about that?
Well, just to put it in context, when just before we got married, I went to see our GP, Andrew Sword, and told him that I was getting married to a haemophiliac who was positive, and he was so kind, and he just said to me, Amanda, I don't know what you're going to need in the future, but whatever you need, come and ask me, and I'll see what I can do. And so that's what we did, and he stood by his word all through, and was a tremendous support. So when we were going to the haemophilia centre and having discussions and trying to ask questions about the treatment and options and so on, and getting the response all the time that Dr. Wasif would have to consult with his colleagues in London. And we just thought, well, why are we talking to a doctor who doesn't seem to be able to give us the information but can talk to a doctor in London? Why don't we go and talk to the doctor in London ourselves? We'd like to be talking to them directly. So we went back to Andrew Sword and said, please, can you refer us somewhere for HIV help? And he referred us to the Chelsea in Westminster. And I have to say that was quite different. When we got there and we met with the consultant David Asbo, who was just a wonderful doctor. And I mean, he didn't know about haemophilia, and there were some issues around that, but it was so easy to talk to him. He just knew so much, and so you could ask him anything about the drugs, and he would have a reasoned discussion with you It was very much, he treated us as equals. In fact, when we first started seeing him, I didn't even know he was a consultant. I thought he was a registrar. His manner was just so down to earth and friendly and welcoming, and so it was so easy to talk to him about things. But the doctors at the Trelaw Haemophilia unit never forgave me, and it was particularly me, because I think they thought I'd marched Andrew off to London. It was a joint decision. I would never have done anything with, I was often his mouthpiece, because he found it quite difficult to assert himself, but I only ever did what he wanted me to do, and it was our decision that we should go to London, but the doctors, I say at Trelaw's, never forgave me for that.
You've described in your statement a number of side effects and physical health problems that Andrew experienced. He had nightmares from one of his treatments.
That was very, very scary time, and he had very vivid nightmares and would wake up talking absolute rubbish, and it was very scary.
He had peripheral neuropathy, which he described as having red-hot pokers forced up through his feet into his legs.
I think sometimes people think peripheral neuropathy is just something like pins and needles, and the way he described it was just excruciating pain.
And then he suffered acutely with kidney stones and with pancreatitis, and on one occasion was rushed into hospital in Basingstoke.
I think on 2 occasions. So with the kidney stones, which I think was the first one, I was actually out. I'd gone to get my hair cut about 15 miles away from home, and he suddenly became very, very poorly at home. He phoned the haemophilia centre, and they just said to him to go to hospital. So I think what they should have done is phoned for an ambulance for him, because he was in dire straits. But they just said, you've got to get yourself to hospital. He wasn't well enough to drive, so he rang my mum, and she rushed him to the hospital, phoned me to say that that's what was happening. So I rushed out the hairdresser's with wet hair, so frightened because I didn't know what was happening, and I just thought, he could die before I get there. Days before sat-nav, so I didn't, although I've been to Basingstoke several times, I've been to Guildford several times, but I was in Guildford, I didn't know how to get from Guildford to Basingstoke easily. It was just such a panic. But anyway, I got there. But when Andrew arrived at the hospital, my mum dropped him off at the hospital door while she went to park, and he was sick on the steps because he was so poorly with it. I mean, thankfully, once he was made comfortable at the hospital, and I think he passed the stone. I can't remember the treatment for that, to be honest with you. The second time was when he had pancreatitis. We'd actually been to the GP's the day before, and he reported his symptoms, sort of stomach pains and so on. And I don't blame the GP at all for this. It wasn't Dr. Sword, it was one of his colleagues, who were all brilliant with us, I have to say. But she was basing it on her GP knowledge that the symptoms he presented with were typical of sort of indigestion and so on. So she just said, I think it's indigestion, here's prescription for something or other, and go home and see how you get on. But then he became rapidly ill, and it was rushed in, and almost died of pancreatitis the next day. And he was in hospital for a month.
And you've said in your statement that his mental health deteriorated around this time, and in a confused state he attempted to swallow a knife in order to take his own life.
Yes, I mean, he must have been confused to have thought that was a way of taking his life, but yes, I got a phone call because I was staying with him in the hospital overnight, and I'd gone home to be able to have a shower and so on, and I got a phone call to say that he'd attempted suicide, and so obviously I rushed back, and then they told me that he needed to be watched 24 hours a day, but they didn't have the staff to offer that care, so I basically had to live in the hospital. His mum, in fact, actually I think he was in for 6 weeks, because his mum said she had to have 6 weeks off work, and she travelled from Crawley every day to Basingstoke to be with him for part of the day when I went home to deal with home things and to be able to shower and get a meal, because there was nowhere in the hospital I could eat properly, so I was getting a meal and then bringing food back into the hospital with me. But I mean, there wasn't proper accommodation in the hospital for me. I just had to sleep on the floor of his room to make sure that somebody was with him.
You've said in your statement that after Andrew's attempt to take his life, he was offered psychological support in the form of sessions with an art therapist, and he thought that was nonsense and it wasn't going to help him.
No, I think he did have maybe 2 sessions, but no more than that probably. And yeah, he didn't set much store on it.
You also experienced difficulties in terms of staff understanding either the seriousness or the nature of his illnesses. On 2 occasions you've described in your witness statement, one at St Michael's Hospice in Basingstoke and another in Basingstoke District General Hospital. What can you recall about those events?
The one in the hospital was he was in incredible pain with his elbow one night. I mean, just way off the scale from an elbow bleed. So we thought we'd best go to the hospital. I think we may have phoned the on-call haemophilia doctor. I expect that's what we did. And we're told to go to the hospital. So we did that, and there was no haemophilia doctor to be seen. So we were just seen by, I think it was a rheumatology doctor. And they wanted to admit Andrew for the night, but it was just on a general ward, and they were going to put him into a bed next to a gentleman who was coughing and coughing. I mean, really coughing very badly. And I said to the nursing staff, is this gentleman, has he got an infection? And they said to me that he'd got a chest infection of some sort. I said, well, my husband can't stay in a bed next to somebody who's got an infection, because his CD4 count is very low and his viral load is really high. And they just looked at me as like, well, what are you talking about? What do you mean? And they didn't understand that what I was saying was that, Andrew doesn't have an immune system now. You can't put him next to somebody that's got an infection. And so I talked to Andrew about it, and I said, we're not staying here. And they were really cross with me for that. And I said, tell me what you're going to do overnight that I can't do for my husband at home. And there was nothing, this sort of generalised monitoring. You think, yeah, but like what? You haven't got a doctor here who knows what's the matter with his elbow. You can't do anything for that. You're suggesting that he sleeps in a bed next to somebody who could give him an infection he could die of. So you tell me what time you want me back in the morning. I said, if you want me back, bringing Andrew back at 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, whatever, I will bring him back. But he is not sleeping here overnight. So we had to sign this form to say that, we'd been advised that he should stay in hospital and that we were refusing medical advice and going home. But, it was just ridiculous, so we had to do that. And then with the hospice, I think it was when he'd been in the hospital for his pancreatitis. I think it must have been after that. And I was a bit worried about how we were going to manage when we got back home. He still was poorly, and we were told that he could go over to the hospice, which seemed a reasonable idea. But very soon after we arrived there, we went over sometime in the afternoon. Later that afternoon, Andrew went to the toilet and came back and said to me that he was urinating with blood. He was passing blood. And unusually for a haemophiliac, he'd not had that happen before, and we were quite worried by it. It's a new symptom, and so just, goodness, what's happening, what's going on? And so I said to the hospice staff, please, could we phone somebody or can you, or we phone someone from the haemophilia centre? And this is pre-days when everybody had a mobile phone, so I had no way of just doing that for myself. Otherwise I'd have done it. But I was reliant on them, and they just kept saying to me things that I'd got to accept that my husband was going to die, that he was poorly, he was going to die, and I couldn't just keep, looking for treatment for him, sort of thing. And it's like, this is an acute haemophilia problem that maybe because we didn't know what was happening, maybe he could die of this today. He doesn't need to die today of this. Get me the treatment, get him the treatment, get somebody here. I don't know quite how I managed it in the end, but we did actually see a haemophilia doctor who then dealt with it, you know, and all was okay. But the level of ignorance about haemophilia and HIV and what we were going through was just incredible, really, and just again this. I'm always having to fight with medical professionals to get treatment that you need, and having to understand and know. I mean, you had to be knowledgeable yourself to try and get the treatment right, because nobody seemed to be joining up the dots, and nobody seemed to be offering comprehensive care. I remember sometimes when Andrew was ill, I think there was one particular thing when he had something come up on his face, and it always seemed to happen in the night. And I was just beside myself because I just thought, who do I phone? Do I phone a GP? Do I phone a haemophilia doctor? Do I phone Chelsea and Westminster for HIV doctor? What kind of a problem is this? Who is going to advise me? And I think in the end I phoned the GP on call, and they put me in touch with a doctor at the hospital. And I could tell I was speaking to a very junior doctor who, bless her, was trying her hardest to help me. She said, I don't know what to advise you. But we had to be our own experts in it, because nobody else seemed to be, as I say, joining up the dots and offering comprehensive care. And it felt sometimes as if you were just falling through the gaps.
Can you tell us about Andrew's last illness and the events that led to his death?
I should do my best to. So he had a lot of side effects to the treatment. So we got to a point where Dr. Asbo had taken him off all medication, and we weren't ready to try any salvage medication because Andrew had been through so much. It just, he couldn't cope with any more side effects. We had a holiday. We went. We were very fortunate that some teachers at Trelaws had a villa in Spain, and they offered us the use of their villa over a half term. And another very good friend came with us. Andrew suggested that this friend could come with us, and he was able to drive us and help, because I was so frightened that something might happen to Andrew whilst we were away and I wouldn't be able to cope on my own. So our very good friend came with us. We had this holiday. And not long after that, Andrew started becoming poorly with a bad cough. And I said, we needed to tell the doctors about it, and we went to the hospital. I do remember, after the first appointment about that they'd given him some antibiotics, and he actually did say, no more tablets. And in fact, I remember what he said, no more tablets, no more Lindsay. Lindsay was the art therapist, so it was like saying to me, I don't want any more of this rubbish, of anything. And I said to you, you've got to take your antibiotics. This is something that's probably just treatable. Take your antibiotics, and we'll just see what happens next. So he did take his antibiotics. He was compliant, but he got worse over the weekend. So I said, we need to go to the hospital. And we used to have a bag that was all packed, ready to go to the hospital, so that if he had another emergency admission, that we didn't have to panic about things. It was just a bag ready with, he had duplicate pyjamas and all of that. It was all there ready. So, and I said to him, I think we need to take your bag. And he said to me, I know, it's just in case, isn't it? I said, yes, it is, just in case. I won't let them admit you if you don't need to be admitted, but just in case, we'll take you back. And he wasn't well enough to sit up in the car. And I remember we stopped at the garage to get some opal fruits for him because he was very dry and kept coughing. But I say he wasn't well enough, so he lay on the back seat of the car, and I took him to Basingstoke Hospital. And he was later admitted for pneumonia. At the time I thought, well, people don't die of pneumonia anymore, I realised it was an HIV-related illness. But I thought it was his first illness, he wasn't going to die of that. But they couldn't get a sputum sample from him. His cough, although really bad, wasn't productive, so they weren't getting a sample from him. And because of that, they couldn't grow anything to know how to pinpoint the infection. The doctors at Basingstoke, the haematologist there, refused to phone Dr. Asbo in London, I say, because of this ongoing, in their arrogance of thinking that, they knew everything and that I'd been really naughty in going to a doctor in London. They refused to phone Dr. Asbo. And again, because I didn't have a phone, I couldn't just phone him myself. I was feeling very run down. I had many, many nights with very little sleep before that. Didn't feel very strong, and it was something in me. I was thinking, stop arguing with everybody, Amanda. You've got to just let them try and do their job. So I didn't phone David Asma myself at that point. And the doctor said to me, well, it won't be pneumocystis because Andrew's been on pentamidine, which was an inhaled drug, which he used to have, I think, once a fortnight. And so they made this assumption that there was no point in treating him for pneumocystis because it wouldn't be that. I later learned that actually with pentamidine, you're lucky if it actually does get right to the bottom of the lungs, and that's where the infection was. It was at the bottom of the lungs. So it could well have been pneumocystis. He didn't have a post-mortem because I refused that. But so I don't know. I don't know if he died of pneumocystis in the end. But there's a good chance that's what it was. So they didn't treat. They didn't know how to treat his pneumonia. I mean, obviously he did have some medication, but I think he was in for about a fortnight. And then on the second Friday, he wasn't any better. And his, I think it was Dr. Roy, who was one of the haematology doctors. I think he was a registrar, I'm not sure. Somebody came into Andrew's room and said to me, could I go down to see Dr. Roy? He wanted to speak to me, and they told me where I'd got to go. Well, I had to go to the other side of the hospital, basically down, about four floors, walk through this like rabbit warren of hospital. Lots of work going on in the hospital, so I remember there being lots of polythene sheeting and scaffolding and stuff, and it was just this kind of like nightmare journey, trying to find where I was going to. Eventually found Dr. Roy's office and went in, and he said to me, there's a possibility that Andrew might die over the weekend, and we need your permission not to resuscitate him. And he explained to me that, excuse me, if they had to give him a blow to the chest to resuscitate him, that would probably cause a massive bleed, and that he could die of that anyway, and that he was very, very poorly. So there probably wasn't an awful lot of value in resuscitating him, because it would just, it would just happen again. So I felt I had no choice really but to say that I gave my permission. Andrew knew that I was going to see Dr. Roy, that I'd been called to see him. I had to walk all the way through the hospital. Excuse me. On my own. Back to his room. With this knowledge that they were expecting him to die over the next couple of days. And we had a policy between us that we were always honest about everything. But I had made a decision as I walked through the hospital, through that filthy pit that's Basingstoke Hospital. I knew that Andrew had known that I'd been called to see Dr. Roy, and I thought, well, if he wants to know what that conversation was about, then he will ask me. And if he asks me, I will be honest and I will tell him. But if he doesn't ask me, I'm not going to tell him. He didn't ask me. I did get tearful because obviously I was very frightened. And his actual words, I mean, this might sound a bit funny, but it's one of the phrases we used to use. Are you having a sad? And I said, yes, I'm frightened of losing you. And trying to make light of it, really, he said, I suppose you'd rather lose me somewhere like Sainsbury's where you're sure to find me again. And I said, yes, I would. So his parents came to see him on the Saturday. His mum came back on her own on the Sunday. And on the Sunday night he deteriorated. He kept insisting on putting on the oximeter to see what his oxygen levels were, and we could see they were falling. And it was obvious he wasn't going to last very long. He had said, I think at some point earlier in the weekend, he'd said to me, I'm very ill, aren't I? And I said, well, yes, you are, but Dr. Roy said he's going to come and see you on Monday to see what they can do. And I believe that he kind of held on to see what Dr. Roy might be able to do on Monday. But he was very, very poorly through the night on Sunday and had to have morphine and so on. He did get very distressed with not being able to breathe properly. In that night, there was a strange thing happened where he'd been sort of sitting up and he slumped forwards, and then and his mum and I looked at each other across the bed and is that it? And then he just came back up and he said, I've died, haven't I? And we said, no, you haven't died, you're still with us. And later he said to me, I wish I could open the door and go into the cool garden. Excuse me. The cool garden. And I got the sense that when he'd slumped forward that time, that he'd had some sort of vision of a garden or something, because I couldn't understand why he was saying that, Why would he just suddenly say, I wish I could open the door and go into the cool garden? And then on the Monday morning, Dr. Roy came to see him. It was obvious that Andrew was dying. There's nothing more he could do for him. He didn't actually put it in those words or anything, but Andrew was slipping in and out of consciousness at that point. And he was gasping for breath. And I'd heard from other people and read, that sometimes when people are dying, they hold on for permission. Just excuse me. Yes, I understood that sometimes people needed permission to die, permission from their loved ones. So I spent a few minutes just saying to him how much I loved him. Oh, actually, I do want to say before I say this bit, but a little bit before that, Andrew had looked at me and said, I've loved you so very much. Goodbye. So he obviously had known at that point that he was going to die. And then, as he was just struggling at the end, I said to him, why don't you open the door and go into that cool garden? I wanted to give him permission to die. Sorry, he died soon after that. It was peaceful in the end. And I hope that he's in that cool garden and that one day I'll be there too.
You held a small but beautiful funeral for Andrew in a
Yes.
church near Trelaws.
Yes, it was such a lovely service. I think I was very fortunate because it sounds an awful thing to say in some ways actually, but in a school like Trelaws, it's inevitable that some of the children there who've got conditions that are life-threatening, that sometimes there's a loss of a child's life. We had a school chaplain because, of the pastoral care. And so the way that they prepared for the funerals for children, which weren't usually held within Trelaws, they'd be wherever the child was from, but the chaplain would ask for people to contribute memories of the child and to be put forward for the funeral service. And so that was my immediate thought, that to have people asked for their memories. So it was really lovely that there were so many lovely memories of Andrew put forward for his service. So although it was a Methodist minister that took the service, although it was in an Anglican church because I was a Methodist, the minister hadn't known Andrew, but rather than being a very impersonal service, because she had all this input of all these lovely memories, that made it very personal. And Andrew he didn't want to talk about what he wanted, for his funeral and everything really, but there were just a couple of times when he said small things to me that about pieces of music he would like. And he said he wondered if his friend Mark Thomas, who had the band, would play at his funeral. And I said I'm sure he would do. And he said, I don't suppose my friend Jerry could take the service, but I'd like him to be involved. And so I asked Jerry if he would do a reading, and poor Mark, I asked him if he could play a couple of pieces of guitar music, which he had to learn very quickly, but he did it, and he did him so proud, and it was just so beautiful. As we walked into the church with Andrew's coffin, Mark was playing acoustic guitar, and it was beautiful. And again, as we went out, and in part of the service, and the church was very full. He was very loved by a lot of people, and I had very much wanted it not to be a celebration of his life, because I thought he's been through such an awful time, but I did want it to be a huge thanksgiving because we were so privileged to have had him in our lives. And that's what it was. It was beautiful. And he wanted to be buried, not cremated, so we walked from the church up to the church annex, that just like a churchyard annex just up the road in Froyle. It's so peaceful. It's surrounded by fields, and I think some people who loved him found it very difficult. I asked for just to be family at his interment, but he'd never wanted his friends to see him when he was poorly, and I felt that he wouldn't have wanted to see him being lowered into the ground, so I asked for it just to be family, which I think actually did hurt one of his friends, and I am sorry for that. But I wanted to carry out what I felt his wishes were. But that was just so... he is buried in a very beautiful place, very peaceful, beautiful place.
It was March 1999 when Andrew died, and he was, I think, 32 years old. And you say in your statement that you have never stopped grieving for him.
No, I mean, he was my best friend. Just as I said at the beginning, he loved me unconditionally. And that is such a gift. I couldn't believe that he would love me. I was very in love with him, and when we were both working at Trelawney's, I remember one day particularly that, so I worked at the Froyle site at the lower school, and he worked primarily at Hollybourne site down the road. And one day he'd come to do something at Froyle, and I didn't know he was working on the Froyle site, and I was just walking across the car park, and he came out of a door, and it was just like, as if I'd seen him for the first time ever. I literally felt weak at the knees. I loved him so much, and we shared so much in the way we used to talk about things. We used to sing in the car together. The stupid jokes we had together, like a shared language that nobody else would understand now. They would just think I was bonkers. And some of his friends might get some of the references, but generally nobody would know. And I miss him. I miss him so much. I do continue to grieve for him. I probably always will. And because he was my soulmate. And there's a Roger McGough poem. I think it's called "The Way Things Are." There's a line in it that says, "When one glove is missing, both are lost." And to me, that was us, because it was like we were a pair, and with one of us missing, the other one is lost. That I am just completely lost in life without him.
I want to ask you finally, if I may, more generally about your experiences and knowledge of Trelawney's, because you have a family connection with Trelawney's that goes back to your childhood and to your father. Could you just tell us a little about that, please?
Yes, Trelawney's has been a huge part of my life, really. So first knew about Trelawney's when my parents fostered a girl from Vietnam who had a spinal injury, and she was sponsored by Lady Sainsbury. I won't go into all of that, but she was sponsored by Lady Sainsbury and to come, she had treatment and so on, and then came to England for her education with the idea that she would be at Trelawney's until she was 19. That didn't work out, and I won't go into that. But so my first contact was her going to Florence Trelawney's school, and we used to come up. We lived in Dorset at the time, so we'd come up to Hampshire to take her to school and then collect her for school holidays, just over the couple of years that she was with us as a family. And I just thought it was this amazing place, really, because I read too much Enid Blyton, so I thought boarding schools were all about thought midnight feasts and things. And my sister did nothing to take that image away, because she did used to tell me about them, sort of getting up to Jinx in the night and having midnight feasts and things. So I just thought Trelawney's was this magical place. And then after my sister returned to Vietnam, my father kept the contact with Trelawney's. He ran a youth activity centre in Weymouth, and used to have parties of the girls to come to go canoeing. I don't know how it all worked out. I was very young at the time, probably about 8 or 9 years old. But the physiotherapist from Trelawney's, Mrs. Bell, would bring these girls down to have a holiday of some sort and let down to canoe. And then my dad got a job in Hampshire, as it happened, as an education advisor, and taught canoeing at Trelawney's on a voluntary basis. He used to go once a week, and I used to go along with him. And my brother worked there for, I think, a year as what they called a medical orderly then, when they had the boys' college and the girls' school. I think days when things were quite rough and ready and a bit brutal, really, there. And when I wanted to have my time out from education, it seemed quite natural then to me that I could perhaps go and do a year at Trelawney's. So, yeah.
And so you did the gap year. I think you stayed longer than that in the end.
Yeah.
As a house parent at what was now a co-educational Lord Mayor Trelawney College. And it was whilst you were working there, you've told us about meeting Andrew for the first time, but you were inspired to train as an occupational therapist.
Yes, not actually from the OT that was at Trelawney's, from somebody else that I met. That my dad used to run summer schools for visually impaired people. I met an OT there called Josie Harrop, who sadly passed away actually, but she was hugely inspirational, and I wanted to be like Josie, so I wanted to go and train to be an OT, but I had to wait an extra year to apply for OT college and do that. Yeah.
And for the reasons you've already given us, you didn't, in that capacity, have a huge amount of contact with the haemophilia boys, but you've said they were a lively bunch and often up to mischief.
Oh yeah, I mean they were just like the life and soul of the school in so many ways. That, I mean, all the children at Trelawn's were valued, and it was very much a can-do school, a can-do attitude to everything. And the things that were done then, the trips that children were taken on, and the activities that were done, just opened them up to all sorts of opportunities. And we believed in them, believed in their potential, all of them. But the boys, were such a lively bunch, and I still have these images of, because Trelawn's was set up like one of the old TB hospitals with cloisters, open cloisters, and you can see them running round there and jumping over the walls and just up to hijinks, and they were a huge part of the school, much loved by us all. Yeah.
And you've wanted to make the point and make it clear that the haemophilia centre, where Dr. Arenston worked from, later Dr. Wassef and others, was not part of the Lord Mayor Trelaw Trust, but an NHS facility, albeit an NHS facility based physically at the school.
Yes, I think it would be very sad if references to Trelawn's within this inquiry were to paint the school and college in a poor light. I know that there were some experiences that some of the boys had whilst at the school and college that perhaps weren't favourable, and that's another thing. But the treatment with the factor 8, the infected factor 8, was not part of what the school were doing. That was the NHS treatment centre that was based at the school for the convenience of everybody, really. But the boys then didn't have to go to hospital every time they had a bleed. They could just go, if they were at the college site, it was just literally there, and if they were at the school site, it was just, say, 3 miles down the road. They could get bussed there and be treated very quickly and monitored appropriately. So.
You qualified as an occupational therapist in July 1984. And in the subsequent year, 1985, you returned to Trelaw's as a unit leader.
Yes. When I qualified as an OT, I didn't feel very confident about my therapy abilities, really. And I didn't want to work in hospital anyway, so I'd done a couple of short-term OT jobs because I knew the district OT, and she'd got a couple of vacancies, short-term. So I'd done 3 months paediatrics, 3 months geriatrics, that's right. And I just didn't like working in hospital and missed the care work, because I have to say my first 2 years at Trelaw's as a house parent were probably the happiest years of my life. I just loved it. I loved the care work. So I went back to that. I worked, the unit leader meant that I was just sort of promoted to where I worked exclusively on mostly on one unit. I had 9 boys that were under my care, including some haemophiliacs. So,
And you stayed there in that capacity until 1988. You don't, I think, remember when you first started to learn about boys having been infected with HIV. Can you recall any advice or information being given by Dr. Arenstam or others in that regard?
I do remember that we used to have updates from Dr. Arenstam at sort of annual staff meetings, and we had generalised advice on how to treat blood spillage in school, so there were sort of guidelines for that we should follow. There was sort of generalised advice on that. What we didn't have was any help to know how to support the boys. Boys that had been diagnosed with the infections and would come back to the house and talk to us about it. We had no training for how to talk with them about that, how to help them come to terms with it, and anything, really, how to support them. So we did our best, but, I was very young at the time. What did I have really to offer them other than a listening ear?
And then you returned to work as an occupational therapist at Trelaws from January of 1991 through to July of 2008.
Yes.
But by that time, there were very few boys with haemophilia left at the school.
Yes, we had 2 boys with haemophilia at the school, but they were quite a lot younger than the cohort that had been infected. So, and I think, there were perhaps a few still at the college just finishing their education, but no, I didn't have any on my caseload as such as an O2.
But you started to hear about former pupils dying from AIDS.
Yes, yeah, that was obviously very scary because, being married to Andrew and there just, being a number of announcements that the boys had died.
And I think you have a memory of at one point receiving a document or a list from the Pupils Association which listed the past haemophiliac students who had died. And you saw on that list the names of boys you'd known.
Oh yes, there were. It was just heart-wrenching to get this list. It was just in everybody's pigeonhole that morning, but I can't remember what reason that the former Pupils Association must have been wanting to bring that to people's attention for some reason. But I just remember reading through the list and just being devastated at, because, these. I remembered the boys so clearly, all the ones that had been through the school anyway. I didn't know the boys that were at college when I was working at the school, so there were a few that I knew the names but didn't know them. But I mean, there are men in this audience who were at Trelaws at the time who are, grown men in their 40s probably now, but I still, if you asked me to picture them, I'd be picturing them as these vibrant young lads that they were, and to just read this list of so many that had died, it was a huge blow. Huge blow.
And do you have any other observations based upon your knowledge of Trelaws generally, your time working there, about the workings of the haemophilia medical centre, the unit there?
I suppose the thing is that they, other than educating us about the infection and making sure that any blood spillage was dealt with appropriately, they didn't. As I say, we weren't helped to know how to support those boys, and I think that there could have been a lot more. It was the unit was they were so paternalistic. They were their boys, and so although they lived with us in the boarding houses, and they ate our meals with us, and they went into school, into the classrooms and everything. So they spent the majority of their days with the school staff. They belonged to the haemophilia doctors, and so that's where everything. I suppose they thought that they were dealing with it all, and I say they just didn't. They didn't appear to have done anything proactively to ensure. I mean, the most important thing is that we weren't able perhaps give the boys the support we could have done if we'd known more and understood more and had the skills, but also how we should deal with this devastating news. When a boy that you're caring for, that you're parenting in some respects, I mean obviously you don't take place of their parents, but you are, you're caring for them on a day-to-day basis, and they come back and tell you they've been given this devastating news. There's feelings in yourself as well to deal with. It's minor in comparison to what the boys are going through, but very little for us to support us either. As to we're losing this community of boys who we loved. We loved the children at Trelaws. It was a loving environment, and to think that a huge group of them had been given this infection, just devastating.
Amanda, those are my questions. I'm just going to ask Mr. Snowdon if he's got anything else. Nothing further from Mr. Snowdon. Is there anything further you'd like to say?
There is, yes. I'd like, if I may, to read an extract, it's like a sort of diary extract, and then I'd like to make a short statement after that. So this is something I wrote a few days after I'd been to the Leeds inquiry and felt very moved by some of the evidence that I heard there, some from people that I knew before and some from people I didn't. And I was really struggling to cope with my emotions afterwards, so I just thought I'm going to put something down on paper to get this out. And this is unedited from what I wrote then. I've been feeling all sorts of emotions which I feel unable to accurately pinpoint and label and unable to express. I feel them bubbling up under the surface, messing up my thought processes, interrupting my intentions and my focus, exhausting me. It feels like something growing inside, preparing to burst out. I want it to burst, to release this terrible tension. I feel a need to cry, to sob, to howl, but only a few teardrops make their way out. Sometimes I want to shout, to rage, throw something, kick something, beat my hands against something. I know there is a depth of terrifying sadness, not just for Andrew and for me, but for all those who also have their stories of loss, of pain, of lives ruined, of babies aborted, the lives lived as reclusives. Lives lived in fear and emotional pain, layered up on physical illness, encounters with death. There are people out there somewhere who caused this. Who are they? Where are they? Escaping justice. I'd like to say a public thank you to Jason Evans for his tireless work fighting for justice and bringing to light the evidence showing that the infection of the haemophiliacs with deadly viruses was no accident. My husband Andrew was one of many with haemophilia who were not just considered worthless, expendable, cheaper than chimpanzees to experiment on, but were considered to be an unnecessary drain on public resources, so could be given treatment that was expected to drastically reduce their numbers. I know this inquiry does not have the power to bring about criminal prosecutions, but I sincerely hope it will be allowed to run its course and will expose the attitudes and actions of politicians, civil servants and medics with such clarity that those who do have the power to prosecute will have no option but to do so, and thereby bring about the justice deserved by the haemophiliacs, those they unintentionally infected, and their families. As they face the possibility of being called to give account for their actions, may those involved in the chain of decisions and events that caused the pain, suffering and deaths of so many now take their turn at being the ones to lie awake in the night, fearing what the future may hold. So.
Thank you. Sir Brian.
Your way of telling it so gently, so calmly and so caringly at the start, I think threatened to hide from us the frustrating and distressing times that you've had. But it didn't in the end. It came through, in my view, very clearly. But underpinning it all, shining through it all, was your great affection for the man you lost. A truly memorable piece of evidence altogether. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, after that, it seems somewhat banal to ask about tomorrow.
So we have tomorrow a number of witnesses, none of them tomorrow anonymous. We're hearing from Stuart McLean, then from Mark Ward and Richard Dudley Smith, and then from Andrula Andreu.
10 o'clock. 10 o'clock, please.